Now, Danny, polls suggest that around 2/3 of Britons want to lift the ban on assisted dying. Tell us why they're wrong.
Well, first, let me just challenge the poll. It's easy to get that answer if you ask the question in a certain way. All the evidence shows that the more people understand about what is actually meant by assisted dying, the less they like it. And when you actually break it down, you get a majority of people opposing a change in the law. I understand, and I would myself support the proposition that people shouldn't suffer terribly as they die and that we should do anything we can to minimise suffering at the end. And I really do understand the argument about people having maximum choice at the end of their life. But I really do worry about changing the law for the simple reason that at the very end of life, or indeed when you're frail, disabled, lonely, vulnerable, poor, you often make decisions that aren't either in your own interest or frankly in the interest of others and your family. So I'm afraid to say I don't think it's right to change the law because of the threat to the most vulnerable people in our society. And really, we should be putting all of this energy and political reform impulse into improving end-of-life care for everybody.
Rebecca, give us the counter-argument. Explain why it's time to change the law now.
I'm obviously coming from the point of view of somebody that has a terminally ill parent who has all her faculties, is, apart from the cancer, is the least vulnerable person you could ever meet and is desperate to be determining her own end. Her great fear, which is a justifiable one, is pain. And she doesn't want her pain to impact our memories of her, particularly at the end of her life, which is what happened with my father. I can tell you second by second what happened when my dad died. I cannot tell you the last conversation we had before that. What Danny has said is all very interesting, except I highly disagree with it because the countries that have brought in these laws now have so many caveats and legislations and protections for the vulnerable people. We are talking about people that have a terminal diagnosis of 6 months or under. We're not talking about vulnerable older people who are just suffering from that terrible illness, which is called age. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about mental illness. We're talking about terminal diagnosis as written off by two separate doctors. So there's a lot of regulation that can be put in place to protect people. There are some people that would try and take advantage of it, but there are criminals in every aspect of life. And that doesn't mean that somebody like my mother, somebody like all the families that I've been meeting through the campaigns of dignity in dying, should go through the processes they've gone through to end their lives the way they choose, which include botched suicides, which include successful suicides with the family finding them, or incredibly expensive lonely trips to somewhere like Dignitas, where the opportunity to have the painless death they want is there. And also in these countries, I just want to say, the report showed that palliative care does not get worse. There is no slippery slope. In many cases, it got better. And it doesn't open the door for a whole range of euthanasia, which is what a lot of the faith groups are worrying about. And if this is a faith issue, I think we should always be open about that. If you disagree with it for religious reasons, that's absolutely your right. I very much respect that. I don't think you should then have an opinion on what my mother does.
Danny, what's your response to that?
Well, there's loads in there. I mean, I certainly don't make a religious argument. I make a practical argument about social justice and about the most vulnerable. And a couple of things that Rebecca said. So the idea that you can draw a line at 6 months is, I'm afraid, arbitrary. It's impossible to predict when somebody's going to die. And it's always possible to find a doctor who will confirm that your illness is terminal. And indeed, that's what happens in the jurisdictions where this is allowed. It's very possible, as people do, to shop around until they find a doctor that agrees with you that your life is worth ending. And that's exactly what happens in Canada and in the US and in Europe as well. I'm afraid it's not possible to introduce safeguards that will work. And I'm afraid Rebecca's wrong to suggest there's no slippery slope. Every single jurisdiction where some form of assisted dying has been introduced has expanded it in one way or another. And of course, that's natural. Once you've conceded that people have the right to ask a doctor to end their life, why should you limit that to somebody who has a 6-month diagnosis or indeed just a physical illness? Why shouldn't that be extended to anybody who has a chronic condition or indeed who's just tired of life or who has a severe mental illness. And indeed, that's what happens again in Canada, in Europe. And of course, right now, nobody's proposing that for the UK. Well, some people are, to be fair. The honest people are. But the campaigners are now saying, no, let's just have it a very small number of people who are, right on the brink of death. But once you've conceded the principle, then the safeguard you've introduced is simply a barrier to a human right that other people will then legitimately and successfully challenge the law to extend. And as I say, every single law, every single country extends it. So what we're just discussing here is the principle, whether it should be acceptable for doctors to kill patients at their request. And I know it's really difficult, and I know there are many people for whom, and myself, I can imagine the circumstances in which I would want this to happen, or my loved one. The point is that death is a terrible thing, and we don't want it to be bad. But you can't draw the line in a way that is safe, except by saying people should not kill each other legitimately, and they certainly should not help each other to kill themselves. That's what the law says at the moment. It's the only safe place to have the law. As I said, what we really should be doing, and I mean, I can't speak to Rebecca's mother's case, but in every single situation, there is good quality palliative care that can be offered, and people should not be dying in terrible physical pain, as she is so naturally worried about. We'd all be terrified of that. People should not and do not need to die in terrible physical agony anymore, because palliative care and end-of-life care, analgesic medicine has come on so much in recent years. We can't say that death will be a lovely experience for anybody, but it is possible to ensure that people do not die in terrible physical agony. And if I may say so, I worry about this debate that we're having, because first it normalizes suicide, and we see that where suicide is assisted suicide is legalized, the suicide in the general population goes up. Just having this debate is in itself dangerous. But we're also suggesting that a terrible agonizing death is the norm or is really common. In fact, it's not really common. It's not the norm, and it certainly shouldn't be prevalent at all. And if only we could put all this energy and all this campaigning power into ensuring that the law that exists at the moment, which is that palliative care should be offered to everybody, if we could actually make that law a reality, then we wouldn't be worried about people dying in terrible physical agony, because they don't need to anymore.
Rebecca, what do you make of that argument about the slippery slope? The idea being that once it's legalised, euthanasia would then be expanded. So initial safeguards would then be changed and shifted, and then you could end up with a situation where we have increasingly different norms about what an assisted suicide death should look like.
Well, it's really interesting because I read the Social Care and Reform report that was brought out earlier this year that looked into assisted dying across the country, that had fantastic evidence that showed that there wasn't this slippery slope. I don't know whether Danny has seen it. The report showed that. It showed that when it is brought in, palliative care improves. The fact is, avoiding a painful death with cancer is really difficult, because there are many types of cancer that the pain supersedes the opioid barrier. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. You will be in ridiculous pain. The only way to get rid of that is sadly to die. It is not a form of suicide because you are dying anyway. You're just making the end fit your life. It's a dignified way to die, having had a dignified life. And I don't really understand how we can take medicines to prolong life and yet not end it, when there's no way that my mother is going to live with this cancer. She has terminal cancer. It is stage 4. It is everywhere. Her end is looking like it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And I've spoken to families whose loved ones were in exactly the same position. And the pain with UK palliative care, which is gold standard, it's the best it can be. It's patchy. It's not in every area. That's something that could be worked on. But when palliative care, when it works in this country, it's brilliant. But some cancer just cannot be stopped in terms of pain. It breaks the opioid barrier. You will be in agony for however long it is. And that is what I want to avoid for anyone I love and for anybody that wants it.
Danny, well, I'll let you jump in on that. But I also want to ask you as well, the argument often is, well, effectively in this country, we have got assisted dying if you're able to afford to go to Switzerland, for instance, and go to Dignitas. Surely there's a sort of recognition that we ought to bring British law up to date to take account of that, when currently it's just merely if you have the funds to be able to go to Switzerland and be able to end your own life if you choose to do so.
Well, I mean, if you can afford to go to Holland, you can take hard drugs as well. I mean, the idea that you could do things in another country, it doesn't mean we should be able to do them here. I'm afraid. So no, we must make our own laws, not just follow other countries. And in fact, it's only a tiny minority of countries that have introduced this law. And I do want to make this point, and we can battle it out on Twitter if you like. Every single country in the world that has done this has extended in some way or other, some dramatically, some less so. They've all expanded the criteria, the eligibility for assisted suicide, because once you've conceded the right, of course you have to extend it to others. But just on this, Rebecca's argument, I understand. Let me just acknowledge, in the interest of having a proper, frank discussion, let me just acknowledge that I understand why, in her mother's case, it might be the right thing to do for her life to be terminated early by a doctor. My challenge, though, is how do you write a law that would ensure that only Rebecca's mother and people in exactly her circumstances would be eligible, but that we would not involve and put at risk vulnerable people? And I'm not really so worried about criminal coercion, because that could happen in all sorts of ways. I'm worried more about people's own internalized way of deciding that they're a burden. And the majority of people in the countries that have assisted suicide who opt for it do so because they feel they are a burden. It's not because of the fear of pain. That isn't the major reason for people wanting it. It's because they think they're a burden on their families and on the health service. And they are, I'm afraid to say, encouraged to think that by a system that says this is an option for you. So what we are saying is to every single family of somebody who is ill or could be seen to be dying, we're inviting them and requiring them, in fact, to have a conversation with their families or with themselves. Is it the right thing for me to do to terminate my life? We are changing the whole nature of the doctor-patient relationship profoundly by introducing this option. And as I say, I don't think we can write a law that would just capture that small number of people that Rebecca is concerned about, but would not also put at risk vulnerable people, the lonely, those with mental health conditions, who would themselves feel obliged to do this. And suddenly, rather than having the right to die, we're moving towards some kind of duty to die, to save the system money, to save your families, your heirs, the cost of looking after you. And indeed, that is an argument which is increasingly being made by people who say we can't afford this aging population of ours. We have to basically terminate the elderly. Matthew Paris made that argument in a Times column the other week. That is the way we are going, unless we maintain the absolute principle that doctors should not kill people. And I'm so sorry, and I really do genuinely mean it, because I feel it myself, and I can imagine myself in Rebecca's situation or her mother's wanting this. But the fact that we might want it for ourselves doesn't mean it's a law that we should pass that will affect everybody, because it will have profound social consequences for the respect that we should have for the frail. And I'm afraid thinking purely about the situation of Rebecca's mother is insufficient as a moral duty we have as citizens to think what is the right law for everybody.
I mean, Rebecca, we know the way in which the NHS is regarded in this country, one of the most revered institutions, according to public polling. How does one stop that kind of pressure in order to kind of put individual lives, weigh that up against the kind of system as a whole, and to kind of stop those kind of societal pressures to encourage people to, end their lives in order to save the system money?
I'm grateful and acknowledging Danny's sympathy and empathy towards my mother's situation. I'm not talking about this from a single point of view. I'm talking about this as somebody that has stood in rooms with hundreds of families and dozens of actual cancer sufferers who are desperate for this law to be brought in. It is not just a personal journey for me, but as with many people like Prue Leith, who I spoke with the other day, you come to these things through personal experience and then you learn more, which is what I did. And I read that report from cover to cover, and I don't see the same evidence that Danny does. I do not see the slippery slope. I do see the expansion and improvement of palliative care in the countries that have brought it in. The countries that also have brought it in, not one of them has backtracked from it. They've not gone and said, actually, this was a bad idea, we'll undo it, because clearly it is a good idea. And there are protections against the frail, which obviously I agree should be put in. I don't believe that just because there are bad drivers on the road, all of us shouldn't drive. I don't believe that because some people will break the laws, other people would have to suffer. I don't think the law works like that. I mean, for instance, and this is a very different case, but with abortion, it's not, when that was legalized, that wasn't suddenly out of control and people were having abortions at 8 months and children were being born and then aborted. That didn't happen like that. And I sort of feel that we're in a dark, nebulous stage with this law where it's massively unclear at the moment, where people can come back from Dignitas having had an extraordinarily awful, possibly the worst of their lives moment, and then face 2 years of prosecution finding out whether they could be jailed for up to 14 years. And it costs thousands of pounds in legal fees, and all their friends, relatives and workspaces are interviewed. And I've heard about families who've come through that. And, there was one sister that tried to commit suicide because it was too much stress, that people thought she may have murdered her mother, when what her mother wanted to do was not die in pain, not be incontinent. Those incredible audio tapes that Dame Diana Rigg did that showed exactly what her death was like. And this is a woman who had access to all the best medical care. She was a very well-off, well-educated, well-supported woman who could have had all the care in the world, did have all the care in the world, and still her death was abominable. And if you listen to those tapes, I cannot understand how you wouldn't want to help her. She's begging to die. She's begging to die painlessly. And instead she is suffering for an amount of time I'm not exactly sure on, but certainly days and days.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Danny. And thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.